Russia has been fighting a handicapped Ukraine for too long. Yes, Ukraine receives plenty of support from its Western allies, such as the United States. But for most of the Ukraine war, that support has come with strings attached. Every weapon that Ukraine receives from the US comes with restrictions on when and how Ukraine can use that weapon. Putin was happy with that situation. Limiting US weapons to use inside Ukraine meant he could continue to batter the country without worrying too much about attacks on his own territory. But now everything looks set to change thanks to US President Donald Trump, and if Trump really does this, it's game over for Russia. But what is Trump about to do? According to several sources from within Washington, Trump is currently mulling over the possibility of removing every single weapons restriction placed on Ukraine by former President Joe Biden. Some of those restrictions had already been lifted, of course. For instance, November 2024 saw Biden announce that Ukraine could start using US-made ATACMS missiles to strike Russian positions both inside occupied Ukraine and in border regions where Russia was amassing threats. However, Ukraine never received carte blanche to use US weapons as it saw fit. That could be about to change. On May 27, the Kyiv Post reported that two sources from inside the White House told its Washington correspondent that big changes may be on the horizon. All the previously imposed restrictions, whether already eased or not, are currently under review as President Trump believes that the current status quo does not serve our common interest of bringing Russia to the negotiation table, one of the sources told the outlet. What does this mean? Right now, it's not yet clear. The source didn't go into any more detail, though there may have been a hint about what Trump is planning to do thanks to an announcement made by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz just a couple of days before. On May 26, AP News reported on Merz's comments that Germany, along with the US, France and the UK, had removed all previous restrictions placed on Ukraine in terms of how it uses the long-range weapons those countries provide. The lifting of those restrictions means Ukraine can also defend itself by, for example, attacking military positions in Russia, Merz said. Until a while ago, it couldn't. It can now. Merz is essentially saying that Ukraine can now strike deep into the Russian heartland with Western-made missiles. A restriction has been lifted. Trump is now considering getting rid of any that remain. What seems most likely here is that Trump is thinking about clearing the path for Ukraine to use other US-made weapons deep inside Russia. Think the F-16s Ukraine has received from several of its European allies, or the Bradley fighting vehicles it's been given by the US. Up until now, those sorts of weapon systems have operated either inside occupied Ukraine or in the border regions, as was the case with ATACMS missiles until very recently. Perhaps Ukraine is about to get permission to use these US weapons inside Russia itself, which could signal a massive shift in America's approach to the Putin problem. The fear of escalation is being thrown out of the window. Trump appears to now be happy for Ukraine to use US weapons to maximize the pressure being placed on Putin. Of course, this leads to the obvious question: why? The first answer comes from the source who delivered the news to the Kyiv Post. That source's mentions of the status quo indicate that Trump has grown sick and tired of Putin's constant refusals to abide by any sort of ceasefire that might allow Ukraine and Russia to negotiate a longer-lasting peace. Trump thought he was on his way to achieving that ceasefire back in March, when his delegate sat down with a team sent by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky in Saudi Arabia. Those two teams emerged with a 30-day total ceasefire proposal that could have set the stage for further negotiations. Putin said no, citing questions that he'd need to have answered while asking about how such a ceasefire would help to solve the root cause of the Ukraine issue. It wouldn't, and it couldn't, because that root cause is the very existence of Ukraine as a sovereign nation. Since then, ceasefire negotiations have seemed like a roller coaster, though they're actually more stable than many realize. The US and Ukraine come up with proposals. Putin does what he's been doing for the last 2 months. He says no. The only ceasefires that Russia's leader has approved are those that serve his own agenda or those he intends to break immediately after announcing them. For instance, Putin said that Russia could engage in a ceasefire over the Easter weekend. It didn't. Russia broke that ceasefire almost as soon as it started, indicating that Putin never intended to stop. In May, Putin also called for a 3-day ceasefire to allow Russia to mark its 80th Victory Day celebrations with a huge parade in Moscow. This time, it was evident that Putin was serving only himself. He used that celebration, which was supposed to mark Russia's victory over the Axis forces during World War II, to schmooze with a few world leaders who still offer some degree of support to Russia. A true ceasefire never was and never has been on Putin's agenda. Fast forward to May 11, and Putin once again refused a ceasefire. This time, Russia's leader said no after Europe attempted to use the threat of new sanctions to push him to stop. As the UK's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, said at the time,
"Again and again, Putin has refused. So we are clear. All 5 leaders here, all the leaders on the meeting we just had with the coalition of the willing, an unconditional ceasefire, rejecting Putin's conditions, and clear that if he turns his back on peace, we will respond. Working with President Trump, with all our partners, we will ramp up sanctions and increase our military aid for Ukraine's defence to pressure Russia back to the table."
Putin said no, again. That no came with a claim that Russia would be willing to hold direct negotiations with Ukraine. But again, strings are attached. Putin is clearly trying to cut the rest of Europe out of the equation, once again signaling that no ceasefire can happen unless it meets his strict and likely Ukraine-ending requirements. About a week later, Trump decided to take the bull by the horns to hold another phone call with Putin. Though Trump described the call as excellent, with Putin adding that the conversation was very meaningful and frank, the outcome was ultimately the same. The US put pressure on Russia to agree to a ceasefire. Once again, Putin said no, and he did it while once again repeating his refrain that any peace could only come if the root causes of the Ukraine war were addressed. In Putin's mind, the only way to achieve peace is for Ukraine to acquiesce to so many Russian demands that it may as well cease to exist as a sovereign nation. Failing that, Putin wants Ukraine to put itself in such a weak position that it'll be ripe for future invasions that ultimately deliver what Russia's leader has wanted since he invaded: total control over Ukraine. All of this is immensely frustrating to Trump. Before he took office for his second term, he repeatedly said that he would be able to bring an end to the Ukraine war in 24 hours. So confident was he in his relationship with Putin and his strength as a negotiator that he felt the end would be inevitable once he became president. Of course, it's now clear how wrong Trump was, but that doesn't change the fact that he's been working hard to achieve some sort of peace, and he's no closer to getting there than he was when he started. Putin is still saying no. Russia's leader is engaged in constant gamesmanship as he attempts to manipulate the US into delivering what he wants out of a ceasefire agreement. Trump is sick of it. When the Washington source says that Trump is looking to break the status quo that's emerged over the last couple of months, what he really means is that Trump recognizes what Putin is doing. Russia's leader claims to want peace when he speaks, only for his actions to disprove the words that come out of his mouth. That became especially clear during the supposed Easter ceasefire, which Putin broke almost immediately. That likely would have led Trump to reconsider where these negotiations were going. However, the straw that likely broke Trump's back came on the weekend after he held his phone call with Putin. Russia launched a record-breaking drone assault against Ukraine. That leads to the second reason why Trump is now considering lifting all Biden-era restrictions on the US weapons being delivered to Ukraine. The US president has finally realized what Zelensky and so many others have been telling him, that what Putin says and what he actually does, at least when it comes to the Ukraine war, are rarely the same thing. Mere days after the conclusion of a call that Trump thought had gone well, Putin once again went back on his claims that he wants peace. Between May 23 and May 25, he unleashed daily hordes of drones that all seemed to target Ukraine civilians. By the end of the weekend, Ukraine said that Russia had sent 900 drones into its cities, resulting in the deaths of at least 13 people, 3 of whom were children. The culmination of these attacks came on May 25. Russia broke its own record for the number of drones it sent into Ukraine within 24 hours by launching a staggering 355 at the country. Those drones were accompanied by 9 Kh-101 cruise missiles, all of which Ukraine managed to shoot down, and they caused at least 6 deaths, 24 injuries, and widespread damage to Ukrainian property. Trump was livid. Taking to his Truth Social platform after the attack, Trump said that Putin has gone absolutely crazy, needlessly killing a lot of people. Trump added, "I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right, but if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia." Quibbles about the accuracy of Trump's claim, the message to Putin was clear. Russia's leader broke what Trump believed to be his word about wanting to achieve peace with these drone strikes. That led to Trump realizing what so many have been trying to tell him since he took office. No matter what Putin says, nothing less than the total capture of Ukraine is good enough for Russia's leader. Russia realized it had angered Trump too. The Kremlin came out with statements claiming that it believed Trump's comments were the result of emotional overload, that is, affecting the US, Ukraine, and Russia. That seems like another Russian attempt to manipulate Trump, only this time it isn't working. The news that Trump is considering lifting the Biden-era restrictions on US weapons is likely a direct response to the actions Putin took over the past weekend. Putin overplayed his hand. He thought he could get away with launching Russia's largest ever drone assault against Ukraine. All he really achieved was to solidify Trump's support for Ukraine, which will only grow stronger if the Biden-era restrictions are lifted. Trump now knows that Putin has spent the last few months trying to play him, and he's ready to respond. Still, it's important to remember that the Kyiv Post Washington sources say that the lifting of restrictions hasn't happened yet. It's still under consideration, which leads one to wonder what comes next. But one thing is known for sure. A meeting is set to happen where the lifting of restrictions will likely be a key topic. That's according to the second of Kyiv Post sources, who told the outlet that Trump will be meeting with German officials in Washington at some point this week to discuss the issue. It's likely Trump's final decision about how to punish Russia for its weekend actions will take place. The source also told the Kyiv Post that Germany's foreign minister, Johann Waderfall, is planning to visit Washington in the coming days. The timing lines up too perfectly for this to be a coincidence. It seems like Waterfall will be present at the meeting the source mentioned, and that means more bad news for Putin. After all, Waterfall was quick to criticize the Russian president on the Monday after his record-breaking drone assault. Waterfall said that Putin doesn't want peace, he wants to continue the war, and we can't allow him to do that. In addition to mentioning the development of a further set of sanctions, Waterfall added, "There will be a reaction from the West, and I think also from the United States of America." It's not a stretch to conclude that Waterfall is traveling to Washington to talk to Trump about what that reaction could be. Based on the German foreign minister's sentiments, along with Germany's recent announcement about the lifting of missile restrictions, it seems likely that Waterfall will push for the elimination of Biden-era restrictions during the meeting. It's also hard to ignore breaking comments from Trump that came after the news leaked that he's considering lifting all US weapons restrictions. On May 29, the BBC reported that Trump appears to have given Putin a 2-week deadline to pull his act together and agree to a ceasefire. After that deadline, Trump will conclude that Putin has been stringing him along all this time, meaning the US's gloves will be off. On May 28, Trump was asked by reporters in the Oval Office whether he thought Putin wanted to end the Ukraine war.
I can't tell you that, but I'll let you know in about 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, we're going to find out very soon. We're going to find out whether or not he's tapping us along or not. And if he is, we'll respond a little bit differently.
It's uncertain what Trump is expecting Putin to do in 2 weeks. It could be that's the deadline Trump has set for Putin to deliver his so-called memorandum of peace that he promised to Trump during their phone call a little over a week ago. If that's the case, Trump may be using that memorandum as a gauge to see if Putin is stringing him along. Assuming the memo contains the same demands that Russia always makes, Trump could end up taking the different approach he claims he's considering. Presumably, that's the lifting of all US weapons restrictions on Ukraine. If Trump expects Putin to declare a ceasefire in the next 2 weeks, it's almost guaranteed that the US will have to take this different approach. Putin has proven repeatedly that he's not interested in any sort of ceasefire because he wants to eradicate Ukraine. Either way, Trump appears to be leaving it up to Putin to make his mind up for him. Assume that Putin doesn't meet the 2-week deadline and the US does lift its weapons restrictions. Here's what that means for the Ukraine war, according to Jorge Rivero. Speaking to the Kyiv Post, the Russia-Ukraine specialist, who's based in Washington, explained that Ukraine will benefit massively from Trump's move. The relaxation of restrictions could allow Kyiv to target military installations within Russian territory, including air bases responsible for launching Geran 2 drones and strategic bombers that have conducted sustained strikes against Ukrainian cities, Rivero claims. Of course, Ukraine has already been doing that, but up until now, it's been restricted to using its own weapons, including domestically produced drones and missiles, to conduct these strikes. The lifting of US restrictions opens up a whole new arsenal for Ukraine to use, especially when it comes to conducting more accurate and devastating strikes against Russia's military installations. This policy shift could further authorize Ukrainian forces to engage Russian command and control nodes, as well as logistical arteries deep inside Russia with precision-guided munitions, Rivero adds. Again, that's something Ukraine has been attempting to do with its domestically made weapons already. But with US weapons added to the mix, Russia now faces strikes against which its already battered air defense systems may not be able to defend. Therein lies the problem for Putin. As Rivero explained, Russia has operated for the last 3 years under a sort of shield. The US limitations on Ukraine using the most advanced weapons it's provided against Russia have allowed Putin to both guard and maximize the use of some of his most vital military infrastructure and supply chains. The result has been that Russia could always maintain the pressure it's exerting on Ukraine, whether that be via the drones, missiles and glide bombs it launches from its air bases, or ensuring a consistent flow of supplies to its ground forces. If Trump lifts the US restrictions, all of that comes to an end. Removing these constraints could alter that tactic, enabling Ukraine to disrupt the logistical and operational framework sustaining Russia's war effort, Rivero adds. This development will likely complicate Russian operational planning and threaten the continuity of supply lines that have sustained Moscow's campaign since 2022. On the ground, that means only one thing: Russia's forces become much weaker. The ground offensives Putin has used to occupy Ukraine's territory, which are already showing signs of becoming less effective, descend into chaos without proper operational frameworks. That chaos creates opportunities for Ukraine. Defensively, it'll be fighting less organized forces that aren't equipped as well as they have been in the past. The same is true offensively, with the added benefit of this disorganization creating gaps in Russia's defenses that might allow Ukraine to start retaking territory Putin has already claimed. Add all of this to the possibility that Trump will also approve new sanctions against Russia, such as the recently proposed 500% tariffs against Russian oil, gas and uranium customers, and the pressure mounts up for Putin. Russia's economy will start to creak under the strain as US-made weapons rain down on military targets that Putin never thought in his wildest dreams would be in danger. And it's all happening because Putin refused to agree to the ceasefire Trump negotiated with Ukraine. In the coming days, Trump's final decision about lifting Biden-era weapons restrictions will become clear. And at least as of right now, all signs point to him doing just that to punish Putin for stringing Trump along over the past couple of months. But if those months have taught anything, it's that it's impossible to predict with 100% certainty what comes next for the US and its Ukraine policy. Ukraine will hope that Trump follows through and lifts restrictions. If he does, the US will change the entire complexion of the Ukraine war in a heartbeat. But what do you think about the news that Trump is edging closer to lifting restrictions on the US weapons being sent to Ukraine? Should this have been done sooner? What impact will it have on the Ukraine war? Share your opinions with us below, and don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show for more of the latest developments in the Ukraine war, the Middle East, and other military conflicts around the world.